It is easy to look at the pyramids and see only the finished product, immense, immovable, and perhaps a little indifferent to the passage of time. Yet, behind every block stands a history of ordinary people doing what they were told, one stone at a time. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from.
And what time it is.
It is always interesting to see who is joining us from around the world. Now then, let us ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in ancient Egypt during the Old Kingdom, somewhere between the reign of Djoser and the ambitions of Khufu, in a landscape where the Nile provides more than just water. Here, the river is the axis on which the state turns, dictating when to sow, when to reap, and for a fortunate few, when to drop everything and report for pyramid duty. The air is dry, the sun unwavering, and the sand does not politely wait outside the village. It moves in, with or without an invitation. Some facts from this era are remarkably persistent. Despite their improbability, workers were not slaves in chains, but villagers and artisans rotated in from all corners of the kingdom, receiving regular wages of bread, beer, and onions. The state, with the reliability of a determined clerk, tracked their attendance, their meals, and their illnesses, producing more records than some later kings managed to leave in their tombs. One can read, on a sun-baked piece of papyrus, the complaint of a worker excused from his duties because he had been bitten by a scorpion. A workplace incident, both ancient and entirely believable. The same archives lists crew names that would be the envy of any modern sports league, including such memorable teams as the Friends of Khufu and the Drunkards of Menkaure. Imagine a morning at the workers' village near Giza. You wake to the muffled sound of a scribe painstakingly counting loaves, the smell of beer brewing so thick it could almost be sliced, and the occasional commotion of oxen being convinced to cooperate. Workers shuffle out of mud brick houses, rubbing sleep from their eyes, while the more optimistic attempt to air out their linen kilts before the dust claims them once again. There are hundreds of people at work, but each one knows exactly whose ledger they will end up in if they misplace a tool or fail to appear for roll call. The air is filled with a persistent mixture of anticipation and resignation. As useful for building pyramids as any copper chisel, religion lingers around every corner. Small shrines stand at the edges of the settlement, their simple offerings intended to keep both spirits and supervisors satisfied. Each day's work begins with a ritual, sometimes involving little more than a few words and a handful of bread left in the right place. For many, the true miracle is not the pyramid itself, but that the entire process carries on with so few interruptions, save for occasional shortages of dried fish or the outbreak of a collective sore eye. There is, of course, an almost comforting predictability about the whole affair. Scribes recording quotas, laborers arguing over rations, and overseers announcing their arrival with a cloud of dust and a list of grievances. It all forms a background as steady as the sunrise. So as the city stirs and the first shadows fall along the base of the unfinished pyramid, you step into the rhythm of Old Kingdom life, ready to see what daily work looked like at the world's most enduring construction site. The Old Kingdom of Egypt stands quietly at the threshold of recorded history, beginning somewhere around 2600 BCE, and lasting through the centuries when stone and sand became the raw materials of national ambition. The era's heart beats in the Nile Valley, a narrow corridor of green that threads its way through the eastern desert. Each year, the river overflows with a predictability that other civilizations would envy, depositing a layer of fertile silt and dictating the tempo of life. This yearly cycle shapes not only the fields and villages along its banks, but also the great construction projects for which the Old Kingdom would become famous. It is a landscape where palm groves and mud brick villages press up against fields of barley, and where the horizon is occasionally broken by structures that seem determined to outlast both their builders and their original purpose. Village life begins before the light fully returns to the horizon. Roosters are an unnecessary luxury when geese and cattle take it upon themselves To announce the dawn, mud brick houses cluster along raised tracks, their walls patched with the diligence one might expect from people who know the Nile's patience is not limitless. The smell of baking bread mingles with the faint smoke of dung-fueled fires. Most clothing is linen, woven from locally grown flax and bleached in the sun until it achieves a shade only optimists would call white. The typical worker's kilt quickly surrenders to the prevailing color of dust, ensuring that fashion remains a contest of practicality rather than flair. Children carry bundles of reeds, and the sharper-eyed among them collect dry dung for fuel, a practice considered both sensible and slightly beneath the dignity of adults. At the center of this society stands the pharaoh, a figure who is both monarch and living god, whose authority is stamped onto every temple wall and market tablet. Djoser's stepped pyramid at Saqqara and Khufu's monument at Giza begin as ideas, but are soon translated into action by bureaucracy that sees no task as too large or too detailed. The temples serve not only as places of worship, but also as administrative centers, tax offices, and local granaries. Priests move through colonnaded courtyards with the slow purposefulness of those who know they will be here tomorrow. And the day after that, incense masks the more persistent odors of salted fish and livestock. Though not with complete success, religion is everywhere, woven into the daily schedule, justifying both monumental labor and the more ordinary routines of sowing, harvesting, and paying taxes. Agriculture is the backbone of the Old Kingdom's prosperity. The broad fields, marked out by rope surveyors, are sown with barley and wheat, and carefully managed to extract every possible measure of grain. The annual inundation is both a relief and a source of anxiety. When the river rises, as expected, communities thrive. When it falters, the results are recorded for posterity with admirable stoicism and a quietly rising sense of panic. Surpluses feed the laborers and artisans sent to royal projects, where they exchange the rhythms of village life for quotas and crowded barracks. There is little privacy in a workers' village. Kitchens are communal, and arguments over rations are as common as the midday heat. Beer, thick and nourishing, is consumed in generous quantities, partly because water is a dubious luxury, and partly because tradition demands it. Trade links Egypt to the wider world, though these connections are managed with the care of people who know that everything worth having comes from somewhere else. Copper arrives from Sinai, wood from Lebanon, and luxury stones from the furthest reaches of the desert. Most ordinary workers see little of these treasures, except in the tools they borrow, and the amulets that occasionally change hands in the market. Markets themselves are noisy and aromatic, filled with the smell of drying fish, onions, and the faintly acrid tang of tanned leather. Bargaining is not so much encouraged as expected, and the official scribes keep records that seem to outnumber the goods themselves. The architecture of the Old Kingdom finds its fullest expression in stone. Temples and tombs rise gradually, shaped by teams of masons and laborers whose names survive only as the occasional scrawl on a half-buried fragment. These structures are more than symbols of royal vanity. They are evidence of a system where every household, every field, and every hand is counted and accounted for. The sound of chisels on limestone, the steady beat of hammers, and the shouted instructions of overseers form the background noise of Egypt's greatest age of construction. As the sun climbs higher, its heat presses down with an authority that even the pharaoh would respect. Yet, the work continues, as predictable and unyielding as the river itself. The legacy of the Old Kingdom endures not because it was inevitable, but because so many found their place within its steady routines. As construction projects swelled along the Nile, the organization of labor took on dimensions that would impress even the most seasoned administrator. Workforces, summoned from towns and villages, up and down the river, rotated in and out of royal service, in cycles that reflected both the agricultural calendar and the state's need for reliable hands. This was not a matter of random selection. Scribes, armed with reed pens, and more patience for tallies than most could summon, kept precise records of family obligations and quotas. The labor was divided, sometimes by region and occasionally by profession, with craftsmen and stone haulers listed in the same columns as bakers and water carriers. Egypt's famous sense of order was not just a cultural preference, it was a necessity when coordinating thousands of workers and tons of material under a sun that had little sympathy for delays. The daily realities of this system could be seen in the workers' villages that sprang up near each great monument. These settlements, designed with a kind of blunt practicality, featured rows of mud brick houses, communal kitchens, and courtyards, where disputes over rations and lost tools were resolved with the sort of resignation found in any large organization. The air here was thick with the scent of yeast and roasting grain, punctuated by the less appetizing notes of sweat and the occasional cooking fish. Children ran messages or fetched water from wells, while elders might supervise the milling of grain or the baking of bread. Privacy was rare and fleeting. Most houses held several generations. Sleeping mats were rolled out in overlapping patterns, and possessions were stored in clay jars, stacked with military precision. Meals were structured with a predictability that was almost as unyielding as the stone blocks themselves. Breakfast might be a round of flatbread and a cup of thick beer, both practical choices given the day's demands. Onions were prized both for their flavor and their supposed health benefits, leading to the odd sight of workers munching them during brief pauses. Meat was a rare indulgence, usually reserved for feast days or as a reward for meeting quotas. Archaeological remains have revealed that cattle bones and fish scales accumulated around workers' settlements, a testament to both hard work and the occasional success of an enterprising fisherman. Religion was never far from the surface of daily existence. Before each workday, small offerings of bread or beer were placed at shrines built near the edge of the work area. Priests or workers, with a flair for ritual, would recite brief prayers to local deities, asking for strength, protection, or, on particularly trying days, a break from the heat. The spiritual world was not reserved for the elite. Amulets made from faience or carved bone were common among laborers. Painted eyes adorned door lintels and tools, meant to ward off misfortune, or perhaps just to remind fate that the Egyptians were, above all, a prepared people. When injuries inevitably occurred, remedies were applied with the same faith in order and routine as the construction itself. Medical papyri outlined treatments involving honey, oil, and spells, each to be administered with the proper respect for both science and the supernatural. Political events occasionally intruded on this order, though most changes in leadership were felt less in grand proclamations and more in shifts of quotas, taxes, or the urgency behind a project. The reign of Khufu, for instance, was marked by the construction of his enormous pyramid at Giza, a project whose ambitions required unprecedented coordination, inspectors and overseers, sometimes more numerous than the actual skilled craftsmen, enforced the standards of quality and pace that the royal administration demanded. Their presence was unmistakable. Voices carried across the worksite in clipped tones, and any deviation from the prescribed method was corrected with a speed that suggested personal pride was at stake. Evenings in the workers' villages offered a brief pause from this intensity. As the sun lowered itself behind the pale silhouette of half-finished monuments, families gathered for subdued meals. Conversation drifted from complaints about the day's heat or the stubbornness of particular stone blocks to gossip about distant villages or speculation about when the work might finish. The soundscape softened. The thud of hammers and the shouts of overseers faded, replaced by laughter, quiet disputes, and the dull clatter of pottery. Life in the shadow of the pyramids was demanding, but it had a constancy that many found reassuring. The stone rose steadily, a silent record of countless hands, steady routines, and the peculiar dignity of well-organized toil. As the monument's silhouette pressed further into the sky, the organization and pacing of daily work settled into a rhythm that was as carefully structured as the stones themselves. Sunrise brought a slow return to activity. The first to wake were often the bakers, shaping loaves from coarse flour for firing in clay ovens already warm from the previous night. The scent of baking bread was soon joined by the sharper aroma of beer mash, bubbling in large open vats, its thick surface stirred with long wooden paddles. Labourers gathered in the open lanes of the settlement, paced by overseers, whose primary tools were a tally stick and a voice that seemed unaffected by fatigue. Lists were recited, quotas announced, and assignments allocated. Those with the skill for stone cutting made their way to the quarries, copper chisels in hand, while others organized ropes, sledges, and baskets for hauling the day's assigned blocks. The site itself was a patchwork of activity. At one end, teams levered stones from the quarries, carefully choosing each block for size and uniformity. These stones were then dragged on sledges, the sand wetted ahead of each load in a bid to outwit friction. At other points, men climbed temporary ramps, guiding the blocks upward, with a precision that was frequently checked by the watchful eyes of supervisors. The ramps themselves, constructed from mud brick, limestone chips, and debris, shifted and grew as the monument ascended. Building these ramps was a task in itself, requiring nearly as much labor as the pyramid proper. Noise was a constant companion. Copper chisels struck stone, sledges creaked across the sand, and shouted instructions echoed back and forth, forming a soundscape that was both chaotic and oddly reassuring in its familiarity. Work was punctuated by regular, if brief, pauses. Meals consisted of bread, onions, and beer. Water was rationed, dispensed from large jars, watched over by trusted workers. On hotter days, head coverings of linen and reeds did little more than delay the inevitable sunburn. There was little illusion about the discomfort, but breaks were observed with a discipline as old as the first levy of workers. Occasionally, a scribe would walk the perimeter, recording injuries, absences, or the mysterious loss of a copper tool. Illness and misfortune were explained in terms both practical and supernatural. A worker excused for a scorpion bite might return with an amulet or a bandaged limb, while those suffering persistent aches might be prescribed a poultice, a prayer, or both. Amidst the exertion, religion continued to assert its presence. Before a new section of the pyramid was laid, priests would approach, bearing incense and reciting formulae intended to ensure the continued favor of the gods. The boundary between the sacred and the mundane was surprisingly thin. Workers sometimes paused to touch a protective amulet or mutter a quick request to a local deity. Small shrines, little more than a few stones, and the remains of previous offerings were scattered near the site. The spiritual insurance policy was robust. If seldom extravagant, political developments rarely interfered with the daily routine, but they lingered in the background. The reign of Khafre, for instance, carried forward the immense ambitions of his predecessor with new building phases and the addition of temples and causeways. When a pharaoh died, official mourning rippled through the workforce, marked by mandatory rituals and sometimes a temporary slowing of activity. Yet, the system itself absorbed such changes with a steadiness that bordered on indifference. Records indicate that in the midst of dynastic transitions, the allocation of bread, beer, and onions continued with barely a hiccup. Trade routes feeding the project remained active. Timber for scaffolding arrived in occasional shipments from distant forests, the rare smell of resin and fresh wood contrasting sharply with the more familiar scents of straw and dust. Flints and copper for tools kept the smiths employed, their forges tucked away from the main paths, their hammers ringing out at intervals throughout the day. Goods moved predictably, checked and double-checked by scribes wary of shortages or pilferage. The entire economy around the site operated as a closed loop, its outputs measured not in coin but in blocks moved and bread consumed. As dusk settled, activity on the plateau slowed. Workers returned to their clustered homes. The hum of conversation replaced the clamor of construction. Meals were shared, wounds were tended, and the day's grievances recounted in low, resigned tones. The unfinished monument remained in view, catching the last rays of the sun, evidence of steady hands, cautious planning, and a society that found meaning in adherence to order. Even as the desert pressed in, the next dawn would bring more of the same, the cycle turning with the same inevitability as the river's flood. Even as daily life followed its dependable routine, the physical and social environment around pyramid construction sites continued to evolve. The settlement, once little more than an assembly of temporary shelters, developed the features of a small town. New houses replaced the earliest mud brick huts, arranged in tight rows around communal courtyards. Well-worn paths marked the shortest routes from bakeries to storage granaries, and from workshops to the edge of the construction ramps. Shards of broken pottery and discarded stone chips collected in the corners, evidence of steady use rather than neglect. Smoke from kitchen fires drifted slowly across the settlement at dusk, carrying the blended aromas of roasting grains and smoldering dung, a background to conversations carried out in voices roughened by dust and repetition. Architecture within the settlement was functional, but not without small gestures of comfort. Some houses were plastered with a thin layer of whitewash, their entrances shaded by mats of woven reeds. Interior spaces were dim, lit by oil lamps whose wicks threw more smoke than light. There was little furniture, simple benches, clay vessels, and low tables that doubled as storage. Clothing, too, bore the signs of practicality. Most workers wore simple linen kilts, their edges fraying by midsummer into an indistinct beige. Scribes and artisans, enjoying a marginally higher status, sometimes displayed small touches of colored thread or slightly finer weaves. Dust, drifting in every open window, soon rendered such distinctions academic. The rhythm of work shaped the community's internal calendar. Major phases of construction triggered ritual observances. Foundation stones were anointed, and offerings were renewed at the gods' shrines. New arrivals joined the labor force with little ceremony, assigned to crews with the kind of efficiency that left little room for sentiment. Each crew developed subtle traditions, shared meals, personal tokens hidden near work areas, or the habit of carving inconspicuous marks on stones set in place. The occasionally discovered graffiti, scratched discreetly into a block or painted on the back of a ramp, speaks to a sense of camaraderie and the quiet satisfaction of accomplishment. However monotonous, the task, religion's presence, remained constant. Small altars within the settlement held offerings of bread, onions, or dried fish. Each item left with the hope of securing a safer or more prosperous day. Household gods, represented by small clay figurines, were arranged on shelves or tucked into corners, their features worn smooth by handling. Major festivals, tied to the state temples, sent waves of anticipation through the work camps. On such days, extra rations and ritual libations replaced ordinary meals, and work paused long enough for short processions or communal prayers. The official priests appeared, distributing blessings with a professionalism equal to that of the overseers tallying production. The agricultural routines outside the settlement persisted, if less visibly. Fields along the Nile were tended by relatives of the workers, who rotated in and out of the construction service according to the season. Grain supplies were delivered regularly from regional storehouses, their arrival greeted with the kind of relief usually reserved for rain in a dry month. The surplus fed both the on-site population and the complex web of officials and artisans supporting the project. Livestock contributed milk, meat, and hides, while surplus produce sometimes ended up traded for luxuries like incense or copper, depending on the year's harvest. Trade channels continued to shape life within the settlement, though the average worker's access to exotic goods remained limited. Boats on the river unloaded shipments of copper, resin, imported timber, or luxury foods for the higher ranks. Occasionally, rumors of far-off places, Byblos, Punt, or Sinai, drifted through the workers' quarters, carried by overseers or scribes who had seen more of the world than most. The presence of foreign woods or pottery fragments served as tangible reminders that Egypt, while self-contained in many ways, had always depended on its neighbors for rare resources. Most of the population, however, remained resolutely focused on the routines of work, food, and rest, unaffected by the distant politics of trade. Politically, the project's momentum reflected the continuing strength of the pharaoh's authority. Khafra's reign maintained the pace of monumental construction, adding not only his own pyramid, but the Great Sphinx and a network of mortuary temples and causeways. These additions were not simply decorative, they channeled resources and attention, binding regional elites more tightly to the royal enterprise. Scribes recorded transfers of stone, labor allotments, and temple donations in a bureaucratic script that even now survives etched into fragments of limestone and broken pottery. With the sun's return each morning, the settlement stirred, new lists were read, new quotas set, and the cycle resumed. In this world, marked by the slow accumulation of stone and the steady erosion of linen, each individual contributed to a monument whose meaning extended far beyond any single lifetime. What endured, more than the buildings or the rulers themselves, was the quiet persistence of routine, measured, deliberate, and as enduring as the stone blocks that continued to rise toward the sky. Within this landscape of routine and rising stone, the social world of the workers' settlement acquired its own texture and pace. The day's demands were clear, but not without moments of variation. Children, when not pressed into small chores, navigated the alleys between houses with woven balls or makeshift toys carved from discarded wood. Older residents, some too frail for the quarry or ramp, exercised a quiet authority over domestic affairs, offering advice, settling disputes, and occasionally mediating disagreements about the fair division of bread or onions. The slow churn of daily necessities kept everyone engaged, yet the settlement was not immune to minor grievances or moments of humor. Laws officially posted by decree were sometimes interpreted in ways that favored creative memory or appealed to the oversight of a distant scribe. Religious observances remained tightly woven into these daily rhythms, their outward simplicity belying a complex relationship between earthly order and divine favor. The presence of the gods was not abstract. It appeared in amulets strung on worn cords, in marks made on lintels, and in the careful placement of offerings at both household and communal shrines. On festival days, which punctuated the year with a frequency determined more by the calendar of the temple than by agricultural cycles, the atmosphere shifted. Processions wound through the settlement, led by priests whose linen was conspicuously clean and whose voices rose over the crowd. On these occasions, rations might be supplemented with fruit or sweet cakes, theoretically distributed in recognition of collective effort. In practice, the distribution was governed by a logic known only to the scribes and the luckiest families. Architecture beyond the workers' settlement reflected the ambitions of the state and the reach of royal authority. Mortuary temples took shape at the pyramid's base, their massive pylons and columned courtyards constructed from carefully fitted blocks of limestone. Reliefs carved along temple walls depicted ritual scenes with unwavering regularity, priests pouring libations, offerings of fowl and cattle, and the pharaoh, always larger than life, receiving the blessings of gods whose faces blurred the line between animal and human. The temples themselves were echoing, cool spaces filled with incense and the measured footfalls of priests and officials. Outside, causeways connected tombs and temples to the main approach roads, their paving stones worn smooth by the procession of years and feet. Trade flows remained essential to the functioning of the settlement and the construction site. Copper and turquoise from Sinai, limestone, and granite, quarried from distant outcrops, and resin from far-flung forests, continued to arrive in steady, if sometimes unpredictable intervals. The administration took a dim view of shortages and pilferage, so inventories were kept with a diligence verging on obsession. At the river docks, boatmen unloaded crates and bundles, watched by scribes with styluses, poised, ready to record every amphora and log. Occasionally, a shipment of timber from Lebanon or cedar would cause a stir, its perfume briefly overwhelming the familiar odors of mud and grain. Craftsmen prize such materials, reserving them for the most visible and prestigious elements of the temples or tombs. The agricultural world, though operating at a measured distance from the hubbub of stone construction, was never far from mind. Floodwaters marked the year's beginning, and their retreat signaled the start of sowing. Those workers whose turn had come to serve at the pyramid returned to their fields only when released. Sometimes with hands still rough from stone, sometimes with stories of supervisors whose reputations had grown faster than the pyramid itself. The produce of the fields, transported in woven baskets or packed into jars, arrived in the settlement with a regularity that the scribes found satisfying and the workers found necessary. On lean years, complaints filtered up through the ranks, making their way onto clay tablets, or, less officially, into the grumbles shared at evening meals. Political events rarely brought abrupt change, but their influence was subtle and palpable. The reigns of Khafre and his successors saw the consolidation of centralized authority, the standardization of building practices, and the increasing prominence of royal mortuary cults. The state's reach extended deep into the lives of the laborers, yet for most, the ebb and flow of daily concerns, food, family, minor squabbles, and the hope for a day of lighter work, remained paramount. Royal visits were rare, marked by a brief flurry of preparations, the sweeping of streets, and the sudden appearance of temporary banners. For the most part, the pharaoh's presence was mediated by overseers, inspectors, and the omnipresent scribes. Evenings brought a gentle unraveling of the day's tension. Workers gathered in small groups, sharing simple meals, tending to cuts and bruises, and occasionally recounting encounters with the less predictable elements of the workforce, whether stubborn oxen, inattentive supervisors, or spirits rumored to haunt the edges of the site. The settlement, with its narrow lanes, communal courtyards, and persistent layer of dust, became almost peaceful as the sun fell behind the rising pyramid. The quiet echoed with the persistence of daily routine, a reminder that the greatest monuments relied as much on the endurance of ordinary people as on royal ambition or divine favor. Night in the settlement was hardly silent, but its sounds were gentler and less insistent than the noise of the working day. Underneath the slow, unhurried sweep of stars, families retreated indoors, some sharing stories beside oil lamps that flickered and guttered in the hot, stagnant air. A few voices drifted out into the darkness, mothers scolding children for lingering too long, men discussing the relative merits of tomorrow's supervisors, the sharp bark of a dog, unsettled by a passing shadow. The walls of the houses, built from layered mud brick and insulated by years of repairs, released the day's stored heat in a slow sigh. On the rare occasion when the wind shifted from the river, it brought a trace of coolness and the scent of damp reeds, a temporary relief from the ever-present dust. Within these narrow alleys and crowded courtyards, illness and injury were facts of life. The stone, for all its grandeur, was not a forgiving medium. Cuts, bruises, and the occasional broken limb were met with a stoicism that bordered on habit. Healers in the settlement worked with poultices of honey and oil, applying linen wrappings and reciting prescribed words for good measure. A medical kit was likely to contain little more than a bronze blade, jars of ointment, and a few charms for warding off the attention of malevolent spirits. Some wounds healed quickly with a bit of luck and rest. Others lingered, a reminder that the price of monumentality was measured in more than just stone. Scribes continued their work after dark, tallying the day's production by the dim light of their lamps. Their clay tablets and ostraca accumulated in well-organized piles, each column of numbers a testament to the kingdom's devotion to counting things, be it bread, onions, or absent workers. Occasionally, a minor dispute would flare over rations, or the loss of a prized tool, drawing in mediators, armed with an even tone and a memory for previous infractions. Serious offences were rare, but not unheard of. The records mention theft, brawling, and once a rather drawn-out disagreement over a chicken. Punishments ranged from extra shifts to the public reading of one's misdeeds, a practice that ensured everyone else listened very attentively. The next time tools were distributed, the world beyond the settlement remained close and yet curiously remote. Temple complexes at the pyramid's base were quiet after sundown, their courtyards now empty, but still smelling of incense and burned offerings. Priests made their rounds, checking on the sacred fires and occasionally pausing to adjust a statue or leave a fresh offering. The stone colossi and painted reliefs absorbed the moon's pale light, their carved faces as impassive at midnight as at noon. Sometimes, a festival or official religious observance would stretch into the darkness, the sound of chanting and drums drifting over the plateau, a reminder that the sacred remained vigilant even when most of the living were trying to rest. Trade did not entirely cease with sunset, though it slowed to a trickle. Boats moored at the riverbanks, the soft slap of water, and the muted calls of boatmen forming a lullaby for those who lived close enough to hear. Occasionally, a late delivery of grain or imported goods would be met by a group of restless workers, eager to unload the cargo under the watchful eye of a scribe, who was likely more concerned with his tally than the hour. These night arrivals, rare as they were, added a sense of unpredictability to an otherwise well-ordered existence. If a shipment went missing or arrived spoiled, the news traveled swiftly, spurring a round of speculation and, inevitably, a few new entries in the official record. The agricultural year continued in the background, its rhythm unaffected by construction schedules. Outside the settlement, night belonged to the distant fields and canals, the sounds of frogs, the movement of irrigation ditches, and the passing of an occasional herdsman with a reluctant donkey marked the ongoing life of the Nile Valley. Workers who returned from rotation sometimes brought with them updates on flooding, crop conditions, or rumors from upriver. These stories, passed around evening meals, formed a bridge between the monumental and the ordinary, a reminder that everyone was ultimately dependent on the land's annual gift. Despite the omnipresent dust and fatigue, the end of each day brought a measure of collective satisfaction. Routines were preserved, meals were eaten, wounds tended, numbers tallied, stories told. The pyramid stood a little taller, the granaries a little fuller, and the settlement, in all its dusty impermanence, continued to function with a diligence that was, in its own quiet way, remarkable. The night's stillness was not an end, but a pause, the measured breath before the next day's return to stone, sand, and the disciplined pursuit of permanence. Dawn returned to the settlement with little ceremony. Light seeped through reed shutters, and the dust of the previous day hung as a faint haze above the ground. Bodies stirred on woven mats as the first sounds of the morning began, pottery clinking, bread being turned in communal ovens, the low voices of those whose responsibilities began before sunrise. Even the animals contributed, with donkeys shuffling near the granaries and fowl announcing another predictable morning. Within minutes, the settlement recovered its sense of motion, each person slipping into the familiar routines that sustained both the pyramid's construction and the domestic world that surrounded it. The day's first official act was often the reading of lists. Overseers, with a posture that suggested both authority and mild exasperation, announced labor assignments. Scribes checked the names, noting absences and unexpected substitutions with a diligence that implied someone, somewhere, would notice. The rhythm of work crews emerging from the settlement and marching toward the construction site followed the same routes as the sun's rays, straight, unwavering, and not open to debate. At the edge of the site, the division of labor became more apparent. Stone haulers, masons, ramp builders, bakers, and water carriers all found themselves in groups defined as much by skill as by the luck of allocation. The construction site had its own ecosystem. The foundations of the monument, now rising with a kind of unhurried inevitability, were overseen by supervisors who measured and checked progress with ropes and leveling instruments. Teams of men dragged sledges across wetted sand, coordinating their efforts under shouted commands. The return of a block to the bottom of the ramp, due to a miscalculation or an inopportune slip, was met with a patient silence and the knowledge that it would simply be tried again. Copper chisels rang against limestone, and the sharper sound of flint occasionally punctuated the morning when a tool broke or required sharpening. Dust clung to every surface, skin, stone, and tool, settling in layers that no amount of wiping could fully remove. Religion remained a constant companion. Before the most arduous work began, a brief ritual at a small shrine near the ramp's base sought divine patience, and with some optimism, easier labor. Offerings were modest: a piece of bread, a splash of beer, a whispered request to one of the household gods or to more prominent deities whose association with stone or the underworld gave them some jurisdiction over the day's outcome. The priests, when present, maintained an aura of detachment, their role more symbolic than practical, though the workers maintained a respectful attention to their gestures all the same. Meals were consumed quickly and without ceremony. Bread was still the staple, supplemented by onions, dates when available, and the ever-present beer whose thick body substituted for both nourishment and hydration. Water was not entirely absent, but it remained a beverage regarded with suspicion, unless it was drawn directly from a trusted well. Occasionally, a supervisor or scribe would circulate, distributing small treats or surveying the work with an expression that managed to combine disinterest and scrutiny. Agricultural concerns filtered back into the settlement between shifts. News of the year's flood or the promise of an early harvest arrived with newcomers rotating in for their period of service. The state's demand for grain remained steady, granaries filled and emptied in a cycle as regular as the rising sun. Outside the walls, the distant fields continued their own work, tended by relatives in the absence of those conscripted for pyramid labor. Occasionally, the sound of a distant ox or the sight of a dusty cart rolling from the horizon was a reminder that for much of Egypt, the flow of agriculture was as important as the relentless construction of stone. Politically, the period saw the further entrenchment of royal authority. The pharaoh's name was invoked at every major decision point, whether it concerned the allocation of resources or the scheduling of festivals. Building projects radiated the impression of stability and control, cementing the court's relationship with both the priesthood and the provincial administrators. Most decisions affecting daily life, however, were handed down through layers of officials, each with their own interest in preserving the illusion of efficiency and fairness. In practice, complaint and negotiation traveled as quickly as orders, and the system proved as flexible as it was unyielding. As the sun reached its zenith, the rhythm slowed. Workers retreated to shaded corners. The heat made movement expensive and conversation brief, yet the sense of purpose, as measured and persistent as the growth of the monument, carried the day forward. In this carefully structured world, every morning was both a repetition and an assertion of collective identity, a life lived beneath the gaze of stone, sun, and the ever-watchful scribes. As the afternoon wore on, the mood within the workers' settlement shifted. The relentless glare of the sun forced most activity into pockets of shade, where even the most determined supervisors conceded the futility of urging haste. The heat pressed down with an authority that rivaled the pharaoh, discouraging unnecessary movement and rendering conversation low and deliberate. Only those responsible for keeping the ovens stoked, the water hauled, or the injured tended, remained outwardly energetic, their tasks too important to yield to weather. Inside the mud-brick homes, women and older children repaired linen garments, ground grain for the next meal, and occasionally paused to look toward the distant monument. Its outline, shimmering in the haze. In the shadow of the construction ramps, some workers used the lull to sharpen tools or to barter for small comforts, a better chisel, a handful of dates, or a length of cord less likely to fray at a crucial moment. These exchanges were watched closely by overseers, who preferred order in all things. But minor trades flourished so long as the day's quotas were met and nothing vital went missing. The slow hours also provided a rare chance to discuss news that filtered in from the Nile or from administrative scribes passing through. Reports of a successful harvest, a newly appointed priest, or rumors of distant border raids were weighed and measured with the same seriousness as evaluations of bread quality or the likelihood of rain. Religious life, never far removed from daily concerns, adapted itself easily to the rhythm of midday. Some workers sought cool stone shrines within the temple precincts, leaving brief offerings or, in more desperate moments, inscribing pleas for relief from bodily pains. The line between formal ritual and personal superstition was not always clear. Amulets were adjusted, charms retied, and small gestures made toward passing priests, whose presence seemed to guarantee at least a temporary truce between human effort and the unpredictable forces of fate. Trade activities, both sanctioned and informal, continued even in the heat. The approach of a supply boat was cause for subdued excitement. Scribes and foremen appeared as if summoned by an unspoken command, their ledgers and tallies ready to track every sack of grain, jar of oil, or bundle of imported timber. The sight of imported goods, Lebanese cedar, turquoise beads, or foreign pottery, served as quiet testimony to Egypt's connections beyond its own borders. These items rarely reached the majority of laborers, but their arrival represented the smooth functioning of a system that prided itself on the timely movement of resources. Disappointments were not unknown, and the late delivery of a critical shipment or the arrival of spoiled goods found its way into both the official record and the less guarded conversations near the bread ovens. Agriculture, meanwhile, continued its own slow cycle just beyond the settlement walls. The river's receding waters left behind fields ready for planting or harvest, depending on the month. From time to time, an official would arrive to check on irrigation ditches or conduct an impromptu assessment of yields, his arrival greeted with a mixture of caution and polite resignation. For workers still tied to the land, inquiries about home were frequent and typically met with optimistic assurances, whether or not the season warranted them. The settlement's own small garden plots, carefully tended in spare moments, produced assorted vegetables which supplemented rations and offered a semblance of variety in a diet otherwise dictated by surplus and necessity. Politically, the mood near the pyramid was one of controlled expectation. The stability of the current ruler, whether Khafre or his immediate successors, was a subject for quiet speculation. The presence of inspectors and the occasional visit from a high official reminded everyone of the project's importance to royal prestige. The steady progression of the monument was a visual metaphor for the pharaoh's unbroken command, but for the laborers, it was also a cue that the end, though still distant, might one day be reached. Each stone laid, each ramp extended, was an incremental movement within a structure of nearly unimaginable ambition. But the work was divided into measures any household could understand. Tasks completed, rations earned, days endured. As the sun finally began its slow wobble toward the horizon, activity resumed. The last stones of the day were set, tools were collected and counted, and the lingering heat faded into the first hints of evening's calm. The structure on the horizon cast its lengthening shadow back across the settlement, a silent acknowledgement of another day's work. In this cycle, marked by sun, sweat, and the constant murmur of human calculation, each day blended into the next, the rhythm of construction as reliable as the river that sustained them all. Evening arrived, with as much certainty as the tax collector, carrying with it a mood of measured relief. The day's heat ebbed from the mud-brick walls, and the air cooled just enough to coax residents from their shaded corners and darkened doorways. Smoke from the last baking loaves hovered gently above the rooflines, mingling with the less poetic aroma of animals settling in for the night. In the fading light, workers gathered in the courtyards and alleys, their conversations subdued but steady. The persistent grit of limestone clung to skin and hair, but the discomfort was accepted as an unremarkable part of existence. Much like the ever-present dust on the village lanes, the return from the construction site was a slow and communal affair. Crews dispersed along well-worn paths, exchanging brief greetings or sharing news gathered during the slow march home. Upon arrival, most workers set about their evening routines, with the predictability of those who know that surprises are rarely pleasant. Meals were modest, yet sufficient. Bread, onions, lentils, and a thick, grainy beer. On days when the granaries had been recently resupplied, there might also be dried fish, cheese, or perhaps a handful of dates. Preparation took place in communal kitchens, where firelight flickered across clay vessels, and the occasional sound of laughter broke through the usual rhythm of chopping and grinding. Children, hardly deterred by the demands of the day, played with reed balls or constructed miniature monuments of sand. Older residents tended to the communal gardens or took the opportunity to recount stories of seasons past. The arrival of a scribe, carrying his board and stylus, brought a brief hush as he delivered announcements or distributed ration tokens, each marked with the kind of precision that defined the work of the Egyptian bureaucracy. Disputes over allocation, never fully absent, were resolved with reference to the lists, which were assumed to be infallible unless proven otherwise by the rare intervention of a sympathetic overseer. Small rituals, both personal and communal, marked the transition into night. Offerings were left at household shrines: a crust of bread, a pinch of salt, a scrap of dried fish, alongside quick utterances to family spirits and household gods. On days tied to the lunar or temple calendar, the hum of prayer and invocation intensified, with incense smouldering in clay bowls, and the more pious households singing fragments of hymns learned from priests. The influence of official religion was constant, but not overbearing. Large temples remained the domain of priests and officials, while ordinary people relied on smaller, more flexible forms of piety, adapting public liturgy to private hope. The evening was also a time for practical matters. Clothing was rinsed in communal basins, fishing nets patched, and tools checked for chips and cracks. Those who had suffered injuries during the day might receive attention from the settlement's healers, who dispensed honey, oil, and the occasional incantation with an air of quiet confidence. News from the outside world, whether about upriver politics, rumors of Nubian traders, or the health of the crown prince, filtered through the community by way of itinerant laborers and the rare visitor from the royal administration. Architecturally, the settlement began to show subtle signs of wear and adaptation. Walls were reinforced where cracks had appeared, doorways braced against the shifting sand, and new shelters constructed as crews rotated in for temporary service. The larger buildings, storehouses, kitchens, the low offices of the scribes, remained the same, their thick walls a visible marker of the state's enduring presence. These edifices, though neither grand nor ornate, provided an unspoken sense of order, much like the rows of pottery jars and loaves lined up for inspection. Beyond the walls, the landscape shifted to increasing quiet. The fields faded into the soft darkness, broken only by the occasional glimmer of a lantern or the distant sound of an ox plodding home. Along the river, boats moored tightly to the banks, their cargoes secure beneath layers of woven matting. The night cooled the surface of the water, sending brief ripples of mist through the reeds. For most, the day ended with a meal, a word of thanks to the household gods, and the hope that the next sunrise would bring no surprises, just the steady work, familiar company, and the persistent rise of stone against the horizon. The pyramid, still incomplete, but a little closer to its distant promise, watched over all with the quiet detachment of something made to outlast memory itself. Night deepened across the settlement, bringing a stillness that was neither complete nor entirely restful. The low hum of conversation faded as households drifted into sleep. Yet a few faint sounds persisted, the creaking of a reed door, the muffled bark of a watchful dog, the distant splash of water as someone drew a late jug from a communal well. Oil lamps flickered behind narrow windows, casting uncertain shadows onto whitewashed walls. The warmth, left by the sun, lingered in the mud brick, radiating slowly through the cool desert air. For many inhabitants, rest came in brief stretches, interrupted by dreams, aches, or the occasional call of a restless child. Within this nocturnal quiet, the practical machinery of the settlement never ceased entirely. The night watch passed through the lanes, sometimes exchanging words with those tending the communal ovens or keeping an eye on the more valuable stores. Storage rooms with their heavy doors and sealed jars were checked and counted. The scribe's tally stick, serving as both inventory and minor deterrence. In a community built on rotation and replacement, someone was always awake, anticipating the next rotation of families or the early arrival of a shipment from the docks. The rhythm of vigilance reflected not only a concern for theft or mischief, but also a recognition that the machinery of state did not sleep, even if most of its workers longed to do so. Occasionally, the settlement received word of changes in the outside world, a new decree from Memphis, a revision in the rations, or the arrival of a conscripted crew from a particularly far-flung province might cause a stir. Such news was discussed with measured curiosity. Any change in policy or supply could affect the next day's work, and everyone, from the most senior overseer to the youngest apprentice, understood the importance of order. In practice, the interpretation of royal orders passed through multiple layers before reaching the settlement, and each intermediary had a vested interest in presenting the news as favorably as possible. The result was a local version of bureaucracy that was both resilient and, at times, almost cryptic in its efficiency. By night, the monumental architecture beyond the settlement's edge took on a different presence. The unfinished pyramid, visible by moonlight and starlight, appeared both more massive and less tangible, the sharp lines of day replaced by broad plains of shadow. Occasionally, a priest or a pious official would make a solitary circuit around the base of the monument, offering brief prayers or adjusting the placement of an offering at a minor shrine. These gestures, witnessed only by the alert or the particularly sleepless, formed a quiet assurance that the divine was still being courted, even as the human world rested. The river itself maintained its slow, unbothered progress. Barges moored for the night bobbed gently against their moorings, the soft tapping of wood against stone echoing across the water. In the distance, a fisherman's lantern moved slowly along the far bank, its owner taking advantage of the silence to check nets set earlier in the evening. Crops in the nearby fields benefited from the cooler air, their leaves collecting dew that would vanish under the next day's sun. On rare nights, a faint aroma of lotus or wild herbs drifted in from the riverbanks, momentarily masking the more persistent scents of livestock and earth. The social order within the settlement remained stable, if not entirely without friction. Disputes, whether over ration shares, work assignments, or the inevitable wear and tear on shared tools, were often postponed until morning. Elders, respected for their memory rather than their authority, offered quiet advice in the dark, their words rarely disputed when spoken from a sleeping mat rather than a formal bench. For younger residents, the night offered a brief escape from the closely monitored routines of day, a chance to trade whispered confidences or invent stories about distant lands and the mysterious lives of temple priests. In these hours, the state's ambitions and the people's resilience found their most honest expression. The project continued, stone by stone, even as those who sustained it rested as best they could. Morning would bring new lists to read, new quotas to meet, and another chorus of overseers and scribes. But for now the world was quiet, except for the quiet breathing of a community holding together beneath the silent, watchful gaze of the rising pyramid.